First, a round of thanks to you, students, faculty, guests. We're grateful for your presence and for coming to listen to Dr. Maldonado. But let me thank others who made this possible. Sister Diane Steele, Dr. Michelle Metzinger, USM Administration, our wonderful maintenance staff, John Schultz, Sarah Bell, Daniel Swatzel, Dr. Zacharias, Dr. Vanna Quantz, Sharon Lucas, Morrison Community Living, Mel Roberts, and our student assistants tonight, Matt Stanter, Annette Amaya, and Gabby Dupuy. And again, everyone is welcome to the reception after the lecture in the social room. You get there by going to your left, down the stairs, and it's right across from the president's office. We've got a lovely reception waiting for you. Okay. Dr. Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado is Professor of Religious Studies and Assistant Provost of Undergraduate Education at the University of Miami. She received her PhD in Systematic and Philosophical Theology at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California in 2001. Her research and teaching interests include religion in Latin America and the Caribbean, Latina feminist theologies, and interdisciplinary work in Afro-Caribbean studies. She is the author of Sor Juana, Beauty and Justice in the Americas, published by Orbis in 2003. We are so happy to have her. Please, let's give her a wonderful St. Mary welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out on Thursday, right? On a Thursday night, especially the students who I heard a rumor some were required to be here, so try to make it good for you. And those that are here for extra credit. I want to thank the university for the invitation. You know, having been baptized into the waters of liberation theology through a course on Black theology as an undergraduate at Georgetown, I was really thrilled to receive this invitation to speak to you this evening about race and Catholicism. In our time together, I'd like to discuss both the contributions and the limitations of Catholic social thought on racism. I must be honest that in my eyes, the limitations greatly outweigh the contributions. While there are moments in the U.S. Church's history that embodies a public denouncement of racism, this is not a definitive feature of the U.S. Church. And at the core of our time together is an exploration of the relevance of the Roman Catholic faith for the struggle of racial justice in the present United States. I would like to explore how a Catholic method of approaching racial justice can be significant for us today, and also how an emphasis on racial justice can challenge and develop Catholic social ethics. So I'm the daughter of immigrants, or to be precise, political refugees that left Cuba in 1960 after Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. My parents raised me with a simultaneous emphasis on all things Cuban, but also with a deep respect for the United States. My earliest childhood memories are in Spanish. I have no recollection of the English language as present in my life outside of school. However, in spite of being raised in the Cuban microcosm that is Miami, my parents also transmitted a deep love for the U.S. in me and in my brother. My parents had fled Cuba quite abruptly. My grandfather, who was a journalist, was arrested, and word was my father was next. So they didn't have any time to prepare or say any proper goodbyes. So my parents were like the literal American dream. They came here with $100 smuggled in a pen, which they wrapped around the ink cartridge. After spending weeks in Miami faced with signs that read, "No dogs, no Cubans," my father found a job at a dry cleaner. They took English lessons at night at the local public school. Eventually, they saved enough money to move to New York, where my father completed an MBA at NYU. My mother first worked at an orphanage and then as a bookkeeper. Eventually, they moved back to Miami, where my father completed his law degree. Throughout my life, my parents have constantly reminded my brother and I of the opportunities and freedoms here in the U.S., things they have never taken, they never took for granted. And I'd like to think I don't take them for granted either. However, I also know that part of why my parents are immigrant poster children is their political refugee status that they were given immediately upon arriving here, their white skin, and their professional backgrounds. My husband and I were not always so lucky. 15 years ago, we were driving across the country in a U-Haul, bringing my belongings from California to Miami. We were living in Guatemala at the time, and my husband was here on a tourist visa. I was 6 months pregnant. My husband was driving, and we were pulled over by the police for going 10 miles over the speed limit, even though other cars were going much faster and passing us. The officer took one look at my husband's Guatemalan license and passport, which had a visa, and detained him in the patrol car. He then took my license, even though I wasn't driving the car, and left me in the truck. My husband was detained for 2 hours as the officer ran what I felt was an illegal background check on me, since I was just a person sitting in the car, questioned my husband on the authenticity of our marriage, since we had different last names, and demanded to know why I, as a U.S. citizen, was not carrying my U.S. passport on me here in the United States. We were then forced to open our U-Haul, because I think he thought like we were going to open it and like 30 Guatemalans were going to come running out or something, which they did not. It was just my stuff. And then finally, we were released. I sat in the car furious, shaking, and nauseous. It did not matter that I was a U.S. citizen in that moment, or that I had a PhD. All that mattered was my husband was Guatemalan. I cannot even imagine what would have happened if he had been illegal. We were powerless, and we were shamed before that officer, because we knew that if we made any trouble, he was somehow going to be deported or his passport flagged. So I'd like to frame our discussion tonight about, I know, right, racism, like, it's heavy. I would like to frame our discussion tonight about racism and Roman Catholicism in light of Catholicism as an immigrant religion here in the United States. Well, this has been most recently highlighted in terms of Latin American and Caribbean immigrants. Italian, Irish, and Haitian Roman Catholics have all struggled with their cultural identity and how it is transformed in the U.S. context, and how their Roman Catholicism has been definitive in their immigrant identity here in the United States. As the largest growing minority group here in the U.S., as the current face of debates and discussions of illegal immigration, and as an increasing presence in Christian denominations, Latinos and Latinas are not only a symbol of immigrant Catholicism, in many ways they are the future of Catholicism in the U.S. In addition, I would argue, the Latino and Latina community in the U.S. forces us to consider a more globalized American Catholicism that embodies North and South. This is, in my eyes, the current reality of our churches and will continue to be so in the future. So I want to challenge us to think more broadly about the church here in the U.S. It's no longer useful to speak of a northern or a southern church, but instead an American church that embraces all the Americas. And frankly, this isn't a revolutionary statement. The porous nature of national borders is our lived reality today, whether we like it or not. John Paul II was a unifying figure within the American church, demonstrated in his 1999 apostolic exhortation, Ecclesia in America, where he famously declared Our Lady of Guadalupe, who was traditionally a Mexican state, as the patroness of the Americas. When my grandmother arrived here from Cuba, after 10 years of being separated from my mother, she carried one thing with her, a statue of La Caridad del Pobre, Our Lady of Charity, the patron saint of Cuba. The statue was the centerpiece of her living room, surrounded by candles, rosaries, prayer cards, and a collection of smaller statues of saints that dwarfed around her. After she died, the statue moved to my parents' home, where she was given a similar place of prominence. And later, when my mother passed away, she came to my home. Her statue is symbolic of U.S. immigrant Catholicism. It is often touted that the U.S. is a nation of immigrants. We are, for the most part, yet more importantly for our time together today, Catholicism is a religion of immigrants. And I may be stating the obvious, but I think sometimes today when we hear immigrant, all we think about is illegal immigrants and debates about illegal immigration. I'm concerned that we often forget about Catholicism as, in its root, an immigrant religion here in the U.S. So, the Catholic social tradition, which I'll probably refer to as the CST, because that's a mouthful, is known as the Catholic Church's best kept secret. The CST focuses on the intersection of faith and everyday life. At its foundation is the Catholic notion of the common good. The common good teaches us that we are social in nature and thus interdependent. We do not exist as highly isolated individuals, right? So like one example I always give my students is like, try to describe yourself without referring to another person. I can't, because I would say, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a professor. Everything that is about me is a reference to somebody else, right? Is a connection with another human being, right? We exist as a community that is our humanity. The foundation of the common good is the Genesis notion that we are all created in the image and likeness of God, which is probably my favorite line in the Bible because I'm not quite sure what it means, even though I wrote a whole book about it. Yet God, in the Christian tradition, is triune. Therefore, our image of God is the image of the Trinity. And the Trinity reveals a God that is one, but threefold. A God that is constituted, right? That's made up of relationships between the three persons of the Trinity. Relationality is what reflects the image of God within us. And it is through our relationships that we concretely reflect God's image. And so the Trinity is just not like contained either, right? So we see that God not only has this relationship within God, but also a relationship with us and in human history. And so the doctrine of the Trinity also becomes the foundation for Christian understandings of community and consequently the church. The mutual relational love of the Trinity, as expressed through Jesus, becomes the foundation for an egalitarian understanding of our relationships and their formalizations within community. So our imago Dei, right, our image of God, is found in the relational nature of who we are as human beings. Through our relationships with God, our fellow human beings, and the rest of creation, we reflect the image of God within us. And so we're not self-contained, right? We don't exist, and I know that goes very much against U.S. individualism, which is all about the I. And I'm not saying there isn't an I, but the I doesn't exist without the we. You know what I mean? They're interconnected. However, this is not an uncritical and romanticized understanding of relationships, because I think we all know not all relationships reflect the image of God. There can be some very hurtful and damaging and abusive relationships. Instead, relationships are judged against the norm of Jesus' concrete life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Through our mirroring of Jesus' justice-infused ministry, we grow in the image of God. Hierarchical relationships that privilege certain sectors of humanity are deemed unrevelatory, for they contradict Jesus' inclusive vision of community. So within the CST, the Catholic social tradition, human salvation is social. And we're going to get to this in a minute with racism. Sin is also social. So the common good highlights this communal model. And so our salvation is connected to the salvation of humanity. So from the foundation of the common good spirals out a morality that is its foundation. After all, the belief that we are social in nature has moral implications. 3 significant themes emerge from the morality of the common good. The first is rights and duties. Because the CST has a communitarian basis, its morality believes in the positive obligation towards other. Often when we hear the word duty or obligation, it's like things we have to do. But this is not the attitude you're supposed to have, right? Our obligation towards others is something we're supposed to want to do. We want to be in solidarity with our fellow human beings. We want to empower them. We embrace the fact that our love of God is reflected in our love of neighbor. This positive obligation is not only at a personal level, but also at a societal level. Civil, political, and economic rights entail duties, and those are duties of solidarity towards others. So deeply entrenched in the Catholic social tradition is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' pastoral letter against racism, entitled "Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call of Love," and it was published last year, November of 2018. There is much to praise about this document, starting with its mere existence. There's actually a long tradition of the Catholic Church speaking out against racism. This particular document is a follow-up of the 1979 letter on racism entitled "Brothers and Sisters to Us." And actually, a few years ago, I was contacted by the bishop's office and asked if I believe another letter on racism was needed. And, you know, I was enthusiastically like, yes, but sad that I was saying yes. But I said, yes, I do think you all need to do something now more than ever. And this is one area where I think the U.S. bishops have recognized that there can't be one final word. And instead, they are called, I think like we are called, to address racism as it evolves and it mutates in our country. And that's something like I think is so important to understand, is we can't talk about racism 30 years ago and racism today. Racism is like a disease that mutates to survive, right? And so it doesn't look the same for every generation. And so we're constantly having to address it. I'm very much of the school of thought that while we can see, so here's the optimist in me, while we can see a trajectory of social justice movements and historical moments that are actively combating racism in this country. And I truly believe that. But I also believe we can simultaneously see a growing agenda that strive to endorse and maintain racism in all forms. And it's not an either or. They are both happening as we speak at the same time. Early on in their letter, the bishops cite a sense of urgency regarding this issue. And here I quote them: "The persistence of the evil of racism is why we are writing this letter now. People are still being harmed, so action is needed." End quote. The document opens by defining racism and connecting it to sin. I'm going to read you their definition. Racism arises when, either consciously or unconsciously, and I think that's a really important point, conscious or unconscious, a person holds that his, her own, or her own race or ethnicity is superior, and therefore judges persons of other races or ethnicities as inferior and unworthy of equal regard. When this conviction or attitude leads to individuals or groups to exclude, ridicule, mistreat, or unjustly discriminate against persons on the basis of their race or ethnicity, it is sinful. End quote. Racism, the bishops argue, is sinful because it violates justice. The letter defines justice as right relationship with God, God's creation, and each other. Then enters the theological justification against racism, grounded in our egalitarian creation as humans in the image of God. Ultimately, to be a racist is to deny the full humanity of your fellow human being. We can be consciously racist, but we can also be unconsciously racist. The document presents racism as something that can live personally in our hearts, but also structurally in institutions. And the document's a call to conversion of the heart that will lead to social change and the reformation of our institutions and society. We are called to humility, for only then will our hearts be open to the long road of conversion. Part of embracing this humility is acknowledging, as a nation, our original sin of racism. This letter then moves to a history of racism attitudes, practices, and policies toward Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinos and Latinas as exemplary of the ways in which, as a nation, we have failed to address the racism of the past as it now embodied in the present. The bishops turn the bulk of their analysis of institutional racism outward, so it's very much judging of society, citing the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, which continues even today, repeated incidents of police violence toward unarmed black men, an overwhelming number of people of color in our prison system, and the history of racism in the U.S. as a whole. In its section on acknowledging sin, the letter turns to the Catholic Church itself, acknowledging its own participation in the U.S.'s racist history. And while I appreciate the acknowledgement, this section is less than 2 pages. It's like an over 20-page document, but there's very little, do you know what I mean, internal reflection on the actual church. Calls to humility and love, while central, also feel a bit like abstract, right? And leave one feeling powerless in the face of institutional racism. So in the spirit of the letter's call to education, which is one of the things they say, we all have to get more educated about racism, I want to bring 2 conversation partners on this theme to challenge us in this room and also challenge the church in the face of racism. So much has been written about Robin DiAngelo's monograph. It's called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And that's the book title. She opens the book, and she's a white woman, I should say. And she's actually a white woman that she says in the book is writing to a white audience. And she opens the book by arguing that while the U.S. is a country founded on freedom and equality, it is also a country founded on the genocide of indigenous peoples, losing their land, and the abduction and enslavement of African peoples. She also reminds us that race is a child of racism. And this is really important. I quote her here. Exploitation came first, and then the ideology of unequal races to justify this exploitation followed. End quote. And we can talk about that if you wanted to, but that's a really important point. Racism created race. It's only when we began to exploit people that we had to come up with a reason for justifying that exploitation. Right? So if you look at the history of race studies, this is how it sort of unfolded in this country. Until the U.S. acknowledges its original sin of racism, it will continue to thrive unchecked in this country. And the bishops echo this call to address policies claiming that, and here I quote, racism can only end if we contend with the policies and institutional barriers that perpetuate and preserve inequality, economic and social, that we see all around us, end quote. Race is evolving and shaped by history, and in the U.S., immigration played a key role. For some immigrants, assimilation became an avenue to whiten, and economic class was also a factor. DiAngelo defines racism as a racial group's collective prejudice when it is supported by power and legal authority and institutional control. Individual prejudices become a system that no longer depends on individual actors. She reminds us too that often racism is reduced to immorality or extreme acts of prejudices. Right? So people will be like, oh my gosh, I never heard anyone say anything racist, so racism doesn't exist. It doesn't work that way. And for her, she says whiteness is based on the notion that whites are the norm and standard for humans, and that people of color are the deviation of that norm. For DiAngelo, and this is where her book title comes from, white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress in one's life becomes intolerable, triggering defensiveness. And she means two things. Like, number one, she talks about the fact, and remember, she's a white woman writing to a white audience. She talks about the fact that, like, white people need to build up what she calls racial stamina. And so they have to be able to build the stamina to be able to have uncomfortable conversations about race, and that this is not necessarily part of their everyday life. And that's the second point. You know, as a Latina here in the United States, and albeit I consider, you know, I'm a light-skinned Latina, I've always had to talk about race. You know, ever since high school, race has been an issue. Race is, what are you? How many times I've been asked that? Human? You know, like, no, what are you? I'm from the US, no. But like, what are you? Right? So having to be, and that question of what are you is, what it's saying is you're not American, so explain yourself. Right? I can't figure out what you are, where you're from, how you fit in. So, for people of color, for historically underrepresented groups, we talk about racism all the time, and we talk about race all the time, and race affects how we, like, so she on a very basic level is saying, for white people, that's not how their life is defined, necessarily. And so they have to build this sort of stamina to be able to talk about race, because conversations about race are difficult. They're complicated. So, in his very recent book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi presents us, he's a historian at American University, he presents us with the dualism of racist and anti-racist. We are all either one or the other. However, that's not a claim about our nature. For Kendi, we can act racist in one moment and anti-racist in the other. He rightfully reminds us that the term racist is not a slur. It is a descriptor. I'm going to come back to that in a second. He also, and D'Angelo also says this, claims that to call someone a racist is to not make a moral judgment. Right? So they both talk about, in their book, like if you say someone is racist, oh, but they're not a bad person. That's not what I said. I'm not talking about their personal morality, right? I'm talking about, for Kendi, it's someone who is supporting policies and attitudes that are racist. And also, that for both of them, to say something is racist is to describe reality, not to make a slanderous claim against someone. And we can talk about that in the Q&A too. So I have to admit, and maybe we'll talk about this too, I just recently read this book. I'm still processing, he's African American. I'm still processing the book's radical claim, which he makes very early on, that you can be black and be a racist in this country. For Kendi, a racist is someone who supports racist ideas and policies through their actions or their inaction. So doing nothing is doing something, right, in his framework. An anti-racist is one who actively combats racism. So for him, unless you are an anti-racist, actively combating racism, you are a racist. So he wants to get rid of that whole thing, like, I'm not a racist. He's like, no, you either have to be an anti-racist, active, or a racist. So racism for him normalizes racist inequalities. A racist idea is one that suggests one social group is inferior or superior, right? Because if you're saying a group is superior, you're making a racist claim about the other groups to another. So there's no neutrality here, and I kind of like that. Like I said, I just read the book, so I'm still like digesting it, but he's going out there, and he's pushing us not to just say, oh, I'm not racist, therefore I'm okay. For him, he doesn't like to refer to that. So again, to call someone a racist is not to make a moral judgment or express dislike for someone. And in his book, it's interesting, it's part memoir, so he gives all these examples of growing up as a black man here in the United States and times where he saw his own racism throughout his life. So maybe the U.S. Church should write a similar memoir. There's a lack of social analysis in the Church's reflection on racism, and also, frankly, a lack of self-reflection, despite this very fantastic document I've been quoting. As Catholic ethicist and priest, Brian Massingale argues, and he's got a book entitled Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, he says the U.S. Church is a white racist institution where whiteness is normative for U.S. Catholicism. One only has to look at the demographics of Catholics in the pews versus Catholics behind the altar, particularly bishops, to see a disconnect, right? And, you know, I agree with Massingale that the institutional culture of U.S. Catholicism is de facto white. Because if that weren't the case, so if you go to the U.S. Bishop's website, they have cultural diversity subcommittees, and it's for African Americans, Hispanics, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans, right? So cultural diversity, it doesn't have Euro-American Catholics, it doesn't have Italian Catholics, it doesn't have, you know what I mean? So if you're saying this is who we are and these are the diversity groups, you're saying who we are is everyone who's not that. Am I making sense? You know what I mean? Because they're basically saying there's regular U.S. Catholicism, and then these special groups that take care of these special groups in the church. And if Catholics do not understand racism as a force in direct, and this is really important, if Catholics don't understand racism as a force in direct conflict with their faith, they will never become active in the struggle against racial justice. Similarly, if the church does not acknowledge and repent for its participation in racist structures, it will never be a prophetic voice. So I do a lot of research on Catholicism in the Caribbean, and religion in general in the Caribbean. And if you look at the history of the church in the colonial Caribbean, it's marked by the church's complicity and support of Spanish colonial domination and exploitation of indigenous and African peoples. It's a chapter in the church's history where the church and the state are united in their efforts to conquer the Americas territorially, spiritually, and culturally. While Spanish Catholicism, and also French, if you think of Haiti, was not unilateral in its support of the conquest and the transatlantic slave trade, these voices of dissent are the exception and not the rule. So while one finds various clerical voices that argued for and defended the rights of indigenous and African peoples, as an institution, the church remained heavily aligned to the Spanish colonial government, the French colonial government, and the slave trade. And so the church's close relationship with European powers will have a significant impact on the role of the church once these colonies gain independence, right? And become independent from Spain and France, for example. The case of Haiti is singular in this regard, because after Haiti, you know, Haiti is the one successful slave revolt in the Americas, right? So when Haitian slaves gained their freedom and independence from the French in 1804, the Vatican responds by cutting all ties with Haiti from 1805 to 1860 and removing all priests from the island. They were not expelled from the island. The new Haitian government did not expel them, but the church did not want to recognize a nation of former slaves that had revolted against a European colonial power. But you know, even though the church had this very tight relationship with the government, the colonial power, as an institution, it was relatively weak in the Caribbean and also in Latin America. And this is a huge part due to the small number of clergy that were brought to the New World, as we call it, many of which were in urban settings, but in comparison, the actual populations of indigenous and African populations were in rural areas. And so this led to a Catholicism in the Caribbean that's not defined by doctrines or sacramental life and clergy of European Catholicism, and instead more reflective of European folk Catholicism, indigenous beliefs, and African religions. You know, so like my grandmother's altar, like everyone was on that altar but Jesus. Like it was, you know, I guess he was on the rosary, right? But there were no statues of Jesus. It was Mary and the saints, which is very medieval, right? You know, this whole devotion to the communion of saints and Mary. Now, the presence of racism in the church is not just tied to these like big historical institutional actions. I just wanted to give you that as an example. It is also connected to how Catholics overwhelmingly picture, depict, and understand both God and Jesus. So another conversation partner I want to bring in here is Black theology. So Black liberation theology exploded onto the theological and also pastoral arena in the late 1960s with a fervor that ignited the North American and later international theological community. Emerging at the same historical moment as liberation theology in Latin America, these theologies represent a shift in the method and sources of theology. Black liberation theologians introduced the category of race into theological speculation, demonstrating the manner in which historical and contemporary Christianity supports and perpetuates racist paradigms. While Black liberation theologians are not the first to write about the religion of African Americans, they are the first to do it in a theological setting. Black theologians in the U.S. created a wave of confusion and outrage when they claimed that both God and Jesus were Black. James Cone, my former mentor, for example, offers a Trinitarian image of God as Black in solidarity with marginalized people. To know God is to be in solidarity with the oppressed in their struggles for liberation. So Cone says one must become Black like God and participate in liberation struggles. Now, to be honest with you, in my eyes, the most revolutionary implication of these claims was not that the divine was somehow racially Black, but instead that in the minds of most Christians, God and Jesus are white. So everyone freaked out when Black theologians said God is Black, and then they said, look at the artwork in churches. Look at the history of Christian art. Why did you not have an issue with God being depicted as white? Right? No one had an issue with that. So many people would say, but God has no race. We're quite comfortable with the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus and the white male image of God on their church walls, imaging the divine as one social group or gender. And I mean, forget even like, you know, my husband, I love him, but he watches Family Guy, and I don't love that. But you know, like, even on like shows like Family Guy, God is white. Do you know what I mean? Or like, I mean, this is like everywhere. It's not even just like, it's like popular culture, right? I know you're all going to tell me about the films with Morgan Freeman, I know, but there are exceptions. But imaging the divine as one social group or gender distances those who are excluded from those images from their creation in the image of God. So if you say we are all created in the image of God, but you only image God in one way, let's take race as white, then white people look more like God. It's that simple. So the impact of Black liberation theology on the field of African American religion is profound because, and they focused a lot on Christianity and the church. This theological approach grounded Black liberation theology in the civil rights and Black power movement. And they really described Black religion as very justice-infused and traced this whole legacy of justice as a theme in Christianity among African Americans. And so naming Jesus as Black and God as Black recast Christianity where the Christian God interpreted through the ministry, teachings, and suffering of Jesus, is ultimately and exclusively on the side of the oppressed. And sort of one of the classic stories is obviously the Exodus story in the Hebrew Scriptures. Right? The story of Moses, yes. Disney made a film about him, Prince of Egypt. Where Moses liberates his Hebrew people from slavery. Right? They are enslaved by the Egyptians, and they are liberated from slavery by God. And in that story, God takes the side of the slave. Right? And in fact punishes the slaveholder. And yet when we speak about racism in the church, I don't want to just talk about it in terms of black and white, which in the U.S. is often the only way we are capable of talking about race, and we ignore the millions of brown people in this country. So for me, I have, for the past, I guess, year now, 2 years, been paralyzed watching, reading, and listening to what is happening to the children of undocumented immigrants being ripped from the arms of their parents. I have refreshed Twitter feeds, scanned news sites, watched Univision and Telemundo, which is like a whole other level of coverage. I've stared at the faces of my 2 boys, my 2 brown Latino boys that are 12 and 14. I have argued with a lot of my friends, and I sat on my couch and complained a lot to my husband. We Latinos have been called a lot of names in the past few years. We've been called rapists, drug dealers, and animals. Some will respond that the drug dealer and rapist comment only referred to Mexican. But let's face it, we're all the same in the dominant U.S. culture. You know, I have to tell you, I started with the story of my parents, and I'm sort of ending with this one as I start to wrap up. I never thought I would have to explain to my children, and maybe that's showing my own privilege, being raised here. I never thought I would have to explain to my children why people hate people that look like us for no reason. I never, and maybe I'm naive, you know, I don't think my parents thought when they brought, you know, when they came to this country that they were coming and raising children in a country that would later describe them and their communities as criminals, as a virus. And it's been surreal. Because I never thought I would have to do this. You know, this language denies the dignity of the human person and our shared common humanity. And it just mirrors our original sin of racism against black and brown peoples. The question is, how are we going to end this nightmare? I do think we're still living, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. has the very famous, I have a dream speech, which always gets read on MLK Day. Malcolm X, who had a very different background, talks about the American nightmare, right? And I think, like I say, that just as we have struggles against racism active and progressing in this country, I also think we have racist social movements also progressing simultaneously in this country. And I think we are currently living not only the American dream, but also the American nightmare when it comes to race. And we can't be lulled into a complacency that allows us to believe that liking stories on Twitter and sharing moral outrage is enough. Now is the time for vision and action. You know, are we going to sit in silence as we see families suffer in our own backyard? We as a nation are moving down a path of white supremacy, which is part of why the bishops wrote this letter last year. That is all too familiar in the history of our nation. The number of hate crimes and racial racial and ethnic bias surged after the 2016 election. And a March 2018 study demonstrates that hate crimes against Muslims and incidents of anti-Semitism have increased both here in the United States and also in Europe. The nativist rhetoric of brown peoples overrunning this country also must be contextualized in light of the government's abandonment of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and how many, over 1,500, I think we're at 2,000 days, the people of Flint have not had clean water. And we have no funds to help them, but we have tons of funds to massively incarcerate black and brown men, right, at disproportionate rates. So to me, the most striking dimension of this conversation is the invisibility of people. So for example, illegal immigrants exist as invisible, disposable people moving under the radar of the everyday bustle of our lives. Yet their hands touch the fruit we eat. Their sweat waters our lawns, and their arms nurture and embrace our children. Therefore, to truly listen to the illegal immigrant, we must concretely reach out to her or him. And this forces us out of our comfort zone, you know, to truly open our eyes to the realities around us. So, in conclusion, there are many scripture passages I could cite to attempt to ignite the church, and maybe all of us, into action. I often use Matthew 25 with my students, or the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, the simple teaching of love of God and love of neighbor, or even Jesus' Beatitudes. However, the one passage I would like to quote tonight is from Paul, who does not receive the same love from Catholics as he does from our Protestant brothers and sisters. In his first letter to the Corinthians, he writes, and here I quote, "God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong, chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are." So we must allow ourselves to be shamed and acknowledge the ways that we both consciously and unconsciously promote racism. If we do not acknowledge it, then it will continue to fester in us, our churches, and our nation. So my favorite line in Kennedy's book, sometimes like you read something and you're like, oh, I wish I wrote that. My favorite line in his book, he writes, "Denial is the heartbeat of racism." Right? Denial is the heartbeat of racism. So we must change, we must transform, and we must stop denying. This conversion will be challenging. It will take a lot of personal and institutional self-reflection, but it is essential for us and the church. The first step is in combating racism is acknowledging the racism in our midst. Thank you. I'm hoping I have a chaperone. It's there.
Time for questions. Hi. I would just like to ask you what your parents as immigrants think of the current administration's policies on immigration, especially the wall and ICE.
So actually both my parents passed away, so I can't answer that, but I will say, you know, my mother passed away about 6 years ago, and my father passed away a year and a half ago, but he suffered dementia, so he wasn't really aware of what was going on. But I will, you know, I still have some great aunts and uncles that are alive, and I think for them, it's been like a reckoning, and it's certainly in a way for me too, because we grew up very privileged in Miami. Like Cubans are like the darlings of, you know, we escaped communism, you know what I mean? Like they're sort of the poster children they were automatically given, you know, for years there was what was called the dry land policy. If you touched land and you were, even if you came illegally from Cuba, you could stay, no matter what, no questions asked. And so, I think the big shock has been, as is sort of the sort of lost, suddenly Cubans realize, oh, we're just like all the other Latinos and Latinas. Do you know what I mean? And we're sort of being grouped into these categories. In terms of politics, the Cuban American community has historically been extremely Republican, and that's actually changing quite significantly. So on a political front, you are seeing a shift. I'm being like interrogated though with these lights.
I don't know if you can see me back here, but so you said that your boys are like 12 and 14?
Yep.
So they're kind of at the age where like kids are starting to really get into bullying and like teasing and stuff. I've worked in childcare before and I'm a psych minor, so I've seen like what you're talking about like the racism, how like it's just kind of become part of who we are in like society. How do you like teach your boys to stay strong? Like what do you do to help them and tell them like it doesn't matter that your skin is brown, it doesn't matter that, you know, I came from Cuba and your dad's from Guatemala, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're a strong person and like, you know, you're an important part of society. How do you teach that?
Honestly, I raised them talking about it, you know, so for me, it wasn't like I waited, you know, I raised, you know, I always say that like God is punishing me for my feminism because I'm in a house with 3 men, you know, you know, from very young, I taught them about racism and sexism, so they knew it existed, do you know what I mean? And they had the language to understand it, and so it was really, and my husband's from a very small indigenous community in Guatemala. He grew up in extreme poverty. We made sure to go where his parents still live in poverty, go visit them a lot, so they understand who they are and where they came from, and then they should be proud of that. Do you know what I mean? It's not something to be ashamed of. But I think it's also, that goes back to what D'Angelo says about sort of building up stamina to speak about race. Like since they were very young, they understood about racism, sexism, homophobia, because I didn't sort of wait for it to come. I didn't wait for someone to say something either super offensive in front of them, do you know what I mean, either about them or about another group. I sort of made it part of their vocabulary and way of being in the world, and I was so excited. My older son just started high school, and he picked Intro to AFAM as his like elective. I was like, it worked. And he also picked Intro to Religion, but I brainwashed him a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that's the only way, you know, and being very honest, you know, when my kids were very young, like, and this is no judgment, but like I would have friends that were like, oh, we don't let our kids watch the news, we don't like expose them to the world. My husband grew up during the Civil War in Guatemala, where there were literal, you know, battles in his hometown. He was like, I didn't have the privilege of having the world hidden, you know what I mean? Like, and so we also raised them watching the news and like talking about it, because I felt like they should know about the world that's around them. But, you know, it doesn't always work. You know how it is. I don't know what lights we're having right here, but.
So I just had a question for you to kind of expand on where you said Latinos and Latinas are not only a symbol but also the teacher of Catholicism in the U.S.
Yes. The numbers. I mean, so Latinos and Latinas are not only the largest minority in the United States. Latinos and Latinas are also the youngest minority in the United States, which is very important. When we look at demographics. And Latinos and Latinas are also, continue to have the highest birth rates in the United States. And the majority of Latinos, Latinas, Hispanics in this country are US born. Because that's also often a bit. People are like, oh, they're coming here. I'm like, no, we're here. You know, we've been here and we're here. So, in terms of Catholicism, the majority of the Catholic Church today is Hispanic. So when you look at the largest population, of racial ethnic groups in the Catholic Church in the US, it's Latinos and Latinas. When you look at the largest population globally of Catholics, it's Latin Americans. And every study shows us that the majority of Catholics by 2050 are going to be in Latin America and Africa and Asia. And that really what we call the global south is where you're going to see not only Catholicism, but Christianity as a whole. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anybody else? Other questions? Right up here. Oh, there's one over there.
I don't think I'll need it. It's been a long time since I was an undergrad at Georgetown University asking questions in evening lectures, and almost as long as I was in law school asking questions. So I'll try to do it again, if I can remember now. You made a quote from the second book that you had read, a quote by a gentleman from American University.
Oh yeah, Ibram Kendi's book.
Yeah, and you said, he wrote there, you can be black and be racist. And you said twice, I find it hard to process this, and I find it very hard to digest this.
Yeah.
Now, it makes me wonder if you've never heard of Louis Farrakhan, the Black Liberation Army, the Black Symbionese Army, or the Black Symbionese Liberation Army. Do you excuse them, or how do you explain them?
I don't excuse them, but historically, in race studies, definitions of race, and by the way, I'm a Georgetown grad, I did my undergraduate. But historically, race studies and definitions of racism have connected racism with institutional and political power, right? So looking at representation in government, looking at financial power, looking at who are the CEOs of corporations. So looking at who in this country actually has control over financial and political power, and how is it proportionate to the rest of the population. Now what Kendi is saying is that there are people of color that have political power in this country, right? There was a black president in this country. There are people of color that have economic power. So that's like the easy way sort of to explain what he's saying, is that we can't just say only whites have power and therefore only whites can be racist. But what he also argues is that you find within the black community and also the Latino-Latina community no active engagement in terms of trying to combat racism actively in their lives. And because of that, that's why he says that someone who's black or someone who's a person of color can be racist. Because really, going back to this whole question of institutions and social structure, I would argue that the Nation of Islam, which I've studied quite a bit, is not a religious group that has a lot of political power in this country. For example, based again on these traditional definitions of racism. So that's what I meant. And I still struggle with it because I think that his quote can be taken very out of context then. And I don't like anyone being quoted out of context, but I think he's trying to show a bigger picture here in terms of how privilege impacts us in different ways. Another way of thinking about it, God, it just went out of my head. Another way of thinking about it is when we talk about, like today, they talk about intersectionality, right? So that it's not just your racial identity, it's your gender identity, it's your sexual identity, it's your economic class. Like, we're not just one thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure you wouldn't describe yourself with one category. You wouldn't just say your race. Maybe you'd say your race and your gender. Maybe you'd say your religion and your gender. Maybe you'd say your national, your hyphen, right? Cuban American. And so he's also trying to show that identity is a little bit more complicated. And for me, the one thing I like about it is if you always define a group as oppressed or marginalized, like how do they get out of that? Do you know what I mean? So if you always say X group is oppressed, then how are they ever going to escape that oppression if their whole lives are defined by being silenced? I don't know if that answers your question. But that's again in Kendi's framework. Anybody else? Oh, okay. Oh, one more.
Earlier you mentioned in your speech or lecture that racism created race. I was just wondering, who or what do you think created racism?
Really? You don't want to go to the reception? There's wine there. All right. So a perfect example is the transatlantic slave trade. I'll just give one example. So people who have studied the history of slavery know that obviously there was slavery into sub-Saharan Africa and the enslavement of sub-Saharan African peoples from Europeans and also from North Africans prior to the transatlantic slave trade. When the colonizers arrived to the Americas and began to do their thing, their plan was to take the indigenous population as a workforce, right? The problem was because of disease, because of exposure to European diseases, the indigenous started dying, right? So for example, in Cuba, they estimate there were 30,000 indigenous peoples when Columbus arrived. Within 30 years, there are 3,000. So we're talking about sort of a massive extinction that happens because of genocide, because of, and frankly, there's also a very high suicide rate among indigenous peoples. And also just the exposure to Europeans. So then you also have the slave trade happening. And traditionally, the slave trade was ruled by religion and not race. So we know that Muslims that enslaved Africans would not enslave African Muslims. But if you were not Muslim, you were considered other. Christians started to do the same thing. That is why traditionally, especially Protestants would not baptize slaves. Because then you were enslaving a Christian. Right? So there was this notion that you couldn't enslave your fellow Catholics were a little different. They actually did baptize and said they were saving slaves by enslaving them. That's a whole other conversation. So you start to get, and the reason that the transatlantic slave trade became so prolific was in huge part because of climate, because African slaves were able to work in the climates of the Caribbean, of Brazil, of other parts of Central and South America. And so what happens then, once you start kidnapping, abducting, killing, and torturing people, you have to come up with a reason why. You have to come up with a reason why it is okay to do that to them and not to this other person. And so what happens then is develops this myth of this construction of race. I mean, race doesn't exist. It really doesn't. Biologically, we're all the same. The genetic difference there's not a genetic race. Race is a social construction. Right? That's why anyone here from Latin America or the Caribbean or so that's why, you know, when one of my sons has light blonde hair, light brown hair. When he goes to Guatemala, they're like, oh my god, he's so blonde. I'm like, really? Like, you would all look at him and say it's brown hair, but their light brown is blonde. Do you know what I mean? So it depends on, and you might have seen that in different parts of the country that you travel to, or depending on who you're with, people see your race and interpret your race in different ways, because they're different constructions, ways people create racial categories in this country and in other countries as well. So what happens is race becomes this othering of African people based on the color of their skin, based on their religious beliefs, becomes the way that the slave trade is legitimized. That's what I mean. So it wasn't that, we don't see what happens is, oh, African peoples are somehow inferior and therefore we're going to enslave them. It's, we need human labor, so we're going to enslave these people, and then we'll figure out a way to justify it. Does that make sense? So that's like the clearest sort of cut example, but there are tons of really good books on this, actually. But yeah,